Hi class. In this video, I wanted to go over how to set up your printmaking station. Starting off with your anti-slip mat, which is going to be placed on whatever surface you're working on. You're also going to be using your mobile press, which you can position anywhere in the classroom. You're going to need to pick up a squeegee stand along with an appropriate size squeegee. You're going to need paper towels, a bucket of water, sponges, and two spatulas, and don't forget your paint. Also, you're gonna need your blue painter's tape, glue, and you also want to make sure you pick up these little like map cards. They're gonna come in handy. I would recommend getting a handful, probably around 6 of them. And don't forget your screen. So let's get to know our screen a little bit better. I like to flip it around and call this side the well side. That's where your ink is going to be going into. And this is the back side. This is where you're going to be attaching your stencil paper. Before we get started, I like to add these spacers to the bottom of the screen. And the bottom of the screen is usually the side that's closest to you. I take these mat cards and I fold them in half and I tape them to the bottom left and right corners. The reason I do this is because when you're actually like pre- um, applying ink through the mesh with your squeegee, this actually allows you to have a little bit of a rebound between the mesh and your paper, and that way it doesn't actually like stick to it. Um, so this is a nice way to do it before you get started printing. Before we attach our stencil to our screen, what I like to do is actually get a glue stick and run the glue stick along the edges of my cutout. I do this because it gives me better contact between the mesh and the freezer paper. And you always want to make sure that the freezer paper or the shiny side is the side that is going up against your mesh. And this allows for closer contact. So what I'm going to do right here is take my freezer paper. I want to make sure I orient it with the shiny side against the mesh, and I'm going to center it on my screen. And I'm also going to take some of my blue painter's tape and tape it down. That way it doesn't move. I'm not really worried about the registration right now. I just want to make sure that my stencil is in the center of my screen. So that way I can get nice coverage when I'm applying ink to it. So now that my stencil is attached and taped down to my screen, I'm going to flip it around and actually clamp my screen down to my printing press. And you see those are the Jiffy clamps. And I'm going to make sure that my screen is securely attached to those Jiffy clamps. But before I clamp it down, what I want to do is get some mat cards. I'm going to put those in between the clamps and my screen. And the reason I'm doing that is because sometimes when you just when you put the clamps against the screen, there might be some movement because it's metal on metal. The mat card allows it for a tighter fitting and removes the possibility of any like slippage or misregistration. And especially if you're like really have some, if you're dialing in your registration, you don't want these to like loosen up or move around because that'll actually mess up your printing process. The next stage in this process, I want to take my Mylar, which I'm going to be using to register my layers. I want to tape it down using painter's tape and make sure it's flat against my working surface and move my screen down. I want to go ahead and get my ink. I want to make sure I'm going to get a spatula that is clean and apply a bead of the ink at the top of my screen. And I want to be generous with the application so that way I have enough ink to draw from when I'm using my squeegee to push that ink through my mesh to create my image. Now that I have my bead of ink, I want to take my squeegee and I want to flood my area. And flooding means I'm just pulling the ink across. I'm not applying a lot of pressure. I want to fill in those gaps within the thread. And what I'm doing is actually just laying some ink there so I don't have to actually use a lot of pressure when I'm actually applying the ink onto my Mylar. And I'm going to go ahead and dab it and reposition some ink at the top of my screen so I have that ready to go. And I'll go ahead and put my screen down flat against my Mylar. And I want to make sure my hands are holding the squeegee at a 45-degree angle firmly. And I can actually add quite a bit of pressure, downward pressure to the screen as I pull. And I want to make sure my pulls are quick. If I make them too slow, the image might bleed around the edges. So I want to make sure I'm really fast and confident with it. And it'll take a little bit of practice, but I think after the first few times, you'll get the hang of it. So here I am doing my first pull. I want to use firm pressure, firm downward pressure, go quick. And I'm going to raise this up. I'm going to tap to get that extra ink down. I'm going to flood it. And I'm going to make sure I always flood my screen after each pull. I'm going to put my squeegee back in my squeegee holder. And remember, flooding the screen is going to make sure that your screen is still workable and the ink does not dry out while you are, let's say, switching papers or getting things ready for your next printing. So here you'll see that the image or the ink transferred onto the Mylar, just like it would for your sheet of paper. And the reason we do it on the Mylar is so that way you can actually register your image. So right here I'm taking my sheet, which is my key image sheet. It's the same size as the rest of my papers. And I'm going to line it up with the silhouette of my design. I'm going to go ahead and tape it down onto the tabletop. And that's going to let me set the placement for my key image and for the rest of my further prints to come. Now what I'm going to do is take my sponge, I'm going to wipe it off, I'm going to clean off the Mylar, and because I did flood my screen, I still have time to work on this without it drying out, but I do want to work rather quickly. I want to dry it off, remove the Mylar, I don't need that anymore. I'm going to repeat the process for every layer, and now I'm going to get some of my matte cards. So these matte cards are going to be used to register my paper onto the surface of my tabletop. So I'm going to tape those down. I'm going to tape one down on the right side of my paper. And then I'm also going to tape one down on the bottom. I like to keep them kind of close to the edge. So that way I can actually just slide my paper in there and make some quick registration guides. Now I have the paper I'm going to use to start my series of prints, applying the first layer. Normally what you'd want to do is actually use some spray adhesive on the press top so it actually sticks to it and doesn't stick to the screen. There's already some on there, so I'm okay. I'm going to go ahead and move my screen down. I'm going to load up my squeegee with some ink. It has already been flooded, 45-degree angles, firm grasp, and pull. I'm going to tamp it down, and I'm going to go ahead and flood my image area, just pushing the ink across, back to the top, Put my squeegee back in my squeegee holder. And remember, that is already flooded, so I got a little bit of time to work. And then you see the ink transfer on to my paper. And with the registration guides, it allows me to repeat the process over and over. I wanted to skip ahead a little bit and show you what it looks like to print when you already have one layer printed. So I'm going to go ahead and register my paper, which already has my first layer of ink printed on it. It's dry. I squeeze down the screen. I get my squeegee. I want to make sure that I get enough ink on there. I'm going to hold it firmly, 45-degree angle. I'm going to pull quickly, downward pressure. I'm going to tamp it down and flood my screen just by pushing the ink back. Put my squeegee back in the holder. And as you can see, I have my two-color print there to show you. And you would repeat the process for each layer that you're doing. Just make sure you give yourself enough time for it to dry out. All right, so you're ready to clean up. What I want to do is go ahead and make my last print. I'm going to go ahead and apply the ink, but I'm not going to flood it. I'm actually going to pick up the excess ink and start to deposit that back into my container. So I'm going to scoop up as much of the ink as I can onto my squeegee, move my print off to the side. I like to use something like my roll of tape to hold up my screen so it doesn't actually sit on the tabletop. And this allows me some time to actually start doing some of the cleaning. I want to take my spatula and start to scoop up any excess ink off the surface of my screen. Make sure I get as much of the ink out of the well as possible. When you're cleaning your screens out in the washout booth, you want to actually not have too much solid ink in there because that actually does clog up the reservoir and the drains. So you want to make sure you get as much of it off of your screen and your squeegee while you're still at your workstation. And you can even use like your sponges to clean everything up as well. You want to make sure everything is like nice and picked up so you don't actually end up draining a lot of ink into the sink. All right, here we are, just getting as much of the ink off using my sponge and my bucket and getting ready to remove the stencil. Before I do that, I usually like to reuse those spacers that I put on the corners of my screen. It is really efficient just to like put them back on after you end up reclaiming your screen. Right now, what I like to do is I'll remove the stencil, throw it in the trash, and walk my screen over to the washout booth so I can start all over on my next layer. Quick reminder, it's really important to make sure your area is cleaned up. Make sure you loosen up, the hinges off your screen, walk it over to the washout booth, and don't forget to clean your squeegees off as well. If you're using a new color for your next layer, you kind of want to reset by also changing out your water, making sure your sponges are rinsed off. And if you need a different size squeegee, that would be the time to do it. But make sure everything is cleaned up. Hope this was helpful, and I know your prints are going to turn out awesome. Thanks for watching, folks.